Well, it's a mainstay of the company. I mean, literally, the company was operating for about 10 years before I joined it. Obviously, it was very small. But we were managing high dividend stocks literally that predate me, and I've been here for 40 years. So it's an absolute cornerstone of our business. And it's what we have that incorporates in a lot of our equity strategies. But in particular, we have a very specific high dividend, or what we refer to as a dividend income strategy. And what that focus is large cap, both domestic and international stocks. They have some minimum dividend requirements, and the overall focus is to generate a very high yield. We try to target, can't always do it, but we try to target double the S&P 500 dividend flow, and then provide moderate growth on top of it. So the way that we do that, I mean, doing it takes a lot of research and a lot of hard work to really find the names, but the overall philosophy is actually quite simple. Is that, again, we're looking for, as I mentioned, large cap securities that are paying a minimum of a 2.5% dividend. Typically, they're at least $2 billion in capitalization, so they're large companies. We want to see that they've been paying a dividend, well, for at least 5 years. Now, most of the companies we own have been paying dividends for over 20. But we want to see at least 5 years of steady dividend flow and no dividend cuts during that time period, unless there's some extenuating circumstance. There's a merger, or there's a government regulation like happened in TARP. You know, we're not going to go through this with blinders on. You know, we're going to look at reality. But overwhelmingly, barring some unusual circumstance, they've not only paid dividends for over 5 years, but no cuts in dividends for the last 5 years. On average, the income from our portfolios is increasing at about roughly 9% a year. And overall dividend growth by itself is normally averaging somewhere about 6 to 8% a year just from growth of dividends. So what we're really looking for is large cap companies, and frankly, we don't care where they're from. We screen every listed security that's listed on U.S. and American stock exchanges. We screen all the large international companies that have ADRs. So that's the only requirement we have internationally, that we want them to have an ADR. We don't want to get into currency transactions. But that's about 500 names. And basically all the big companies that pay dividends that we're interested in all have an ADR, or an American depository receipt, which means they trade on U.S. exchanges. And we can buy them in dollars. We don't have to buy them in foreign currencies. So what we do, it's about as equal opportunity as you could possibly be. They all go into the hopper. You have about 5,000 domestic names. You have about 500 international names. And let the best man or woman win. We don't care. I don't care if we're 100% international. I don't care if we're zero international. And there's times we've been zero international. Because I'm not going to walk down the hall and say you will be 15% international, because tomorrow then we'll be 15% international. But we'll be buying second stringers instead of buying the best, which may be domestic. On the other hand, I'm not going to say you have to be all U.S., because there might be, in a foreign country, there's a better company that's a technology company or a medical or a biotech that's what we want to buy. So as I mentioned, it's may the best company win in the purest sense of the word. So that all goes in. As I mentioned, we're looking for 2.5% dividends. We are targeting double on the portfolio, the S&P. Right now, we're averaging about 3.6% in dividends, which is almost dead nuts, right at double the S&P, which currently is about 1.8. And so that's the dividend side. And so the first thing that we do, there's really 3 phases of this. And the first thing that we do is, obviously, as I just described, it has to have the dividend. It's got to have it where it's a certain level. They've done no cuts in the dividend. We want to see that basically we have dividend integrity, or we're not going to waste any time on it. All right, now the second phase is really looking at the company's balance sheet. So we really now say it has a dividend level which is acceptable, and so it's worth looking at. So now we want to see what's the integrity of the dividend and where do we fall in the debt structure. And that's a very unique part of our process, because a lot of people look at dividends and they say, well, here's a high dividend, here's a company that pays a dividend, the dividend's rising, that's fine, it meets our criteria, let's go. And to us, that's potentially a ticket to a real problem, if not disaster. Because in many cases, the company may have a very high dividend because the stock value has declined. So it's a high current yield, but it might be caused by a problem, and they're not going to be able to maintain it. So what we want to look at is then say, okay, forget about the dividend. We're now going to look at the balance sheet like we are a bond investor. All right, because that dividend is as important to me and as sacred to me as the coupon on a bond. Now, but I know full well if the company gets into trouble, they're going to cut that dividend or eliminate that dividend long before they miss a coupon payment on a bond and default on a bond. So look, you just have to realize that you're in a secondary position, in a subordinate position to the bondholders. All right, so I want to see who they owe. I mean, what's their outstanding debt? What do they have in bond structure? What do they have in banking debt? What do they have in cash flow to pay their fixed income obligations that are clearly going to have priority over me? And see, and then make sure, okay, there's enough free cash flow after all that debt service that I've got the appropriate coverage, and my chances of having that dividend eliminated because of cash flow coverage, cash reserves, is very, very low, because I'm putting them at a very high standard. We have to realize that the dividend is going to vary. So I'm actually expecting them to increase the dividend and not cut the dividend. I want it to go up 6 to 8% a year. So now what I'm doing is I'm saying, look, I want to look at this like a bond. I want you to pay me like a bond. I want the integrity of a bond, but oh, by the way, it's a variable rate, but the variable rate only goes up. So every year, not only expect you to pay me, I expect you to pay me more every single year. And so I'm holding them to a pretty high standard. So, and if they're doing that and they're meeting all those criteria, then the next thing I want to do is I'm going to go back and look at the last time they had a hard time. When was the last recession? When was the last time they had a business downturn in that sector? When was the last time they got cash squeezed? And what did they do? Did they maintain the dividend? Was the dividend the last thing that they cut after they took all other measures, selling off non-core assets and so on, things that companies do to secure their financials? Or did they go to the dividend first and cut the dividend first and leave the stockholder hanging? I don't want to be with a company management that has that kind of mentality. So that's really looking at their dividend philosophy. All right, so if all those things come together, we know we have a proper dividend level, they're increasing the dividend. We know they have proper cash flow coverage in the balance sheet, that management is committed to the dividend. So we got those two covered. All right, then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take that and I'm going to strip all that away. I'm going to say, all right, now let's look at this stock as though it pays no dividend. Would I buy the stock paying no dividend? Just the stock for the stock because I like the company. And I better be able to answer yes to that question. All right, because it doesn't do you any good to buy a company that has a 4% dividend, dividend's growing at 6 to 8% a year, and then you lose 20% on the stock because the stock goes down. I've never seen an investor that would be happy with that. And I said, I'm not going to be happy with that. So we want to avoid it. So we look at it and say, fine, what's the valuation on the stock? Because our target is to have 3.5%, 4% dividend. We're targeting a 10% total return. So I need 6% that's going to come from the stock. And so I need to make sure that standalone, that stock is going to go good, is going to do well. And so we strip that away and look at it independently. And so those three processes of making sure you have dividend levels and performance that you need, making sure that you have proper cash flow coverages and management support in your dividend, and then making sure the stock by itself is a good investment are really the primary footings of what we do and what we have 5 equity analysts that are doing every day.